So, welcome to the Stellar Hour with Kathy Dreyer and my guest today, Robert Forte. We're going to be talking about current events and, of course, Robert's expertise in psychedelics and my interest in cybernetics. So, Bob and I had a chance to talk a little bit about what's happening in the news today. And I said, hey, let's stop because I'm so interested because you have perspectives and things that I am completely unaware of. So, what we were talking about is John McCain's death, and how that's really causing, I see, I don't know about you, Robert, a lot of divisiveness right now on Facebook. What are you seeing about that?
Well, I'm interested in how, on our general topic here, what brings us together is social engineering and how in this instance, how the media is creating a story, a narrative about John McCain and in more the American military state.
Uh-huh.
And here he is being lauded in the media as a Vietnam War hero. And this unquestioning narrative, the whole, both parties in our government, all the living presidents are coming out to praise this man as a hero of the Vietnam War, and with no critical commentary, like what's a Vietnam War hero, and what was Vietnam really all about?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm really happy to have this conversation with you today, because actually I see it more as a kind of mutual interview, because while we're both interested in social engineering and mind control, you have this tremendous wealth of information that I'm really just beginning to dip into: cybernetics and the Macy foundations and this, several decade-long conspiracies to mind control American society through very systematic plots of using cybernetics and other media technologies. And I come at it from a background in social psychology and the history and psychology of religion, and with a special focus over the last couple of decades on psychedelic drugs, which a field that I was originally drawn into because I see them as the potential for it to be very powerful healing agents in society. And only recently have I begun to dip into understanding how they were originally introduced to be mind control instruments. And seeing both sides of this, this very complicated story about healing agents and awakening, but also mind control. Now, of course, now we have this very celebrated in the media, a psychedelic renaissance, which is casting an illusion that there's something very progressive going on in American society, because these drugs have been branded as awakening, subversive, anti-establishment drugs that help fuel the Sixties movement, anti-war movement. But there's a deeper story to this that I hope we can get at in our conversation.
No, and I think we came to this too, like through, I discovered you like by watching Jan Irvin, and of course, like, my interviews. I can't believe I just did this. With, did that just show up on my screen?
No.
That's weird. With Hans Utter. And so I really want to thank him very much for all he's done for me and the work that we did together on Eyes Wide Open. I've learned so much from him and hope to continue to learn from him. I had never really considered these things before until I started listening to like some of the interviews that he had on Jan's show. That really got me to think about things in a different way and made me really curious and got me researching even more, because one of the things I discovered, there's not really even a language for this. And if we don't have a language for it and an awareness of it, we don't even think about it.
Well, I think that's a result of the mind control that we're talking about, that has been going on for quite a long time. Mm-hmm. We're a very, very confused nation, and to find out where this confusion began, and is going to be the first and maybe the only thing we can do about rectifying our status in the world. And, American students are trained from a very early age to have this kind of unquestioning nationalistic faith in the American exceptionalism right?
Yep,
This
absolutely.
concept of American exceptionalism that we are, was really put forth. It's an old phrase. It goes way back into the 1800s, but it was kind of reborn in the 30s and 40s by Henry Luce, the founder of the Time Life media empire. That Americans had this responsibility to police the world, that we were given these freedoms and this opportunity and these resources and democracy and free enterprise, and we were sort of obliged to spread this out through the world. And it was giving, imperialism this sugar coating, sort of like the Inquisition, back in the 1400s, that the conquest of the New World was to spread Christianity. Well, the New American myth to dominate the world was to spread democracy and free enterprise. So we're
One thing, I'm just going to interrupt real quick. One thing I think is really interesting, Bob, is the use of the word democracy, because the United States was founded to be a republic. But what's interesting is the use of the word democracy, democratic republic, has really replaced that. And I think that's an interesting thing. Do you have any thoughts around that?
Well, that's what I'm talking about. That's another phrase that just goes unexamined. It's just really, like beaten into our heads. Anytime as soon as we woke up in the morning, we put our hands on our hearts and said the Pledge of Allegiance. It's like a hypnotic induction to be lured into this trance that we have this, God-given right and responsibility, in phrases like democracy, when actually, democracy is anathema to the agenda of the oligarchs that are, controlling this system, this society, and that are benefiting primarily from imperialism. And we don't have anything. People are worried these days. We have this monstrous president, Donald Trump, and people are terrified that fascism is coming to America.
Coming?
Yeah, coming to America. I laugh at that. Like fascism coming to America. Fascism came to America in 1963, or you can maybe bring it back earlier than that with the creation of the National Security Act under Truman and the creation of the CIA, or you go further back than that with the creation of the Federal Reserve and our money being controlled by private. I mean, that's what fascism is. I like to look at
fascism too is that the fact that corporations are considered persons too. Under the 14th Amendment, the corporation has the same rights that you and I have.
Yeah,
but not the liabilities.
So I don't know who our audience is or how many people we'll be talking to, but it is really important to, define certain terms like right wing, left wing, or even fascism. Like what do you mean when you say that word? And I like to just use a very simple definition that fascism is when you have private interests controlling public good. And it's kind of the opposite, in my framework, of democracy, where you have a body of people who are voting, and the commonwealth is being shared by an informed and active electorate, and they regulate the greedy impulses of oligarchs. But we don't have that anymore. We have a pretense of democracy, but really we have private interests controlling public good, and especially, I say, since the 1963, because this is my lifetime that I'm reflecting on, with the assassination of you have President Eisenhower's warning at the end of his presidency of the rise of the military-industrial complex, and that's a speech that everybody really needs to listen to. I mean, here's this guy, and he's basically saying, I was asleep at the wheel, and during the course of the last 10 years of my administration, our country has been invaded by an unprecedented, powerful conglomerate of military industrial, and our way of life is under threat. And he said that. He said, he basically apologized, and then he left. And his successor, John Kennedy, really began to do something about it. And that whole episode of Kennedy's administration we really need to go back and look at what happened there. Kennedy was originally elected by his father's cronies to be a Cold Warrior, and he switched, after he was in office for a few months. He had an awakening. I happen to think that awakening was partly inspired by psychedelic drugs, and he began to radically shift. And he said he realized he was being betrayed by the CIA. He was going to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. He began to communicate directly with the Soviet Union, with Khrushchev, through the Vatican, through Norman Cousins, and began to dissemble this whole enterprise. Made this very, very famous, great speech. Everybody should listen to this speech if they get sick of the last, half a dozen presidents we've had. The peace speech given by
John. On the YouTube channel for people to be able to hear that.
June 11th, 1963, where John Kennedy announces the end to the Cold War. He announces an end to nuclear testing. He's speaking like a mystic who's just had a unitive experience, how we all breathe the same air, how we're going to usher in a new age of peace and sustainability and cooperation. We're going to dissemble this global American Pax Americana, take over the world kind of thing, and we're going to, and it's incredible. This is a speech that he gives just a couple of weeks after he's had his first psychedelic experiences administered by his lover, Mary Meyer. A very, very important book written about this by a good friend of mine, Peter Janey. Mm-hmm. Mary's Mosaic. This is, again, I would consider this required reading for a student of not just psychedelics but American history. Mm-hmm. Realize how close we came to a really embodied vision of world peace. And then Kennedy was, of course, assassinated just a few months later. And the Vietnam War then raged on for another, 15 years or something. And it was an atrocity. It was a 20-year-long war crime.
Well, it was also a time where it really shifted the American psyche. It was a trauma. And I don't know that our culture's ever gotten over that trauma. And there's one event after another that continue to traumatize people in the world today. And I think that's being done in an intentional way. So you spoke about defining fascism. How would you define social engineering?
Well, I would define social engineering as, a group of these very sophisticated, very psychologically sophisticated elitists with a long history of manipulating society to preserve the wealth for the elite. We've always had this pyramidal structure in Western history. We have an authoritarian complex, whether it's the ruling monarchies of Europe or the Soviet Union, or it kind of faked in a capitalist system. But you have people tricking the mass of society through religion is one of the main ones. I happen to have a lot of respect for the work and the writing of Joseph Atwill, whose book on the origins of Christianity is another book I would say is required reading, and look at how this began way back in the early days of the Roman Empire, that this religion is created out of nothing.
Well, it seems today now like science is taking over religion, that religion's being broken down in such a way, and it's a culture now of anything goes. Like, be as profane and degenerate as you want, anything goes. And I think this is what's really happening from social engineering, because there really are no more moral guardrails. And then people say, well, what is morality? And they speak really negatively about it. But there is a need for some level of morality and integrity. And so what we see from a social engineering standpoint is actually probably using change as an agent of social engineering to cause uncertainty and instability, and to cause more anxiety and fear. Because I don't even recognize our society anymore. It's so fear-based today.
I find little pockets, and I like to remain optimistic. There are podcasts like this. There are a growing number of podcasts. And if maybe we should just focus on what's been going on in our lifetime, so this is not unwieldy. Just look at I was born in 1956, and Eisenhower issued his speech just a few years later. Kennedy was assassinated. That's basically when the United States was conquered. This is my frame of reference. Mm-hmm. And that's a very offensive notion. And like you said, they a lot of things, it was a trauma. It was a deep trauma. And like a lot of traumas like this, whether we're talking about sexual abuse trauma by elders of the Catholic or virtually any other church, or a parent, that a child has a hard time recognizing that they've been traumatized by the people who they look to for their sustenance and support. A very, very important book on this point was written by Alice Miller, Thou Shalt Not Be Aware.
Yeah, but what's interesting about Alice Miller and like the drama of the gifted child is that she's another who had a lot of great thoughts and great writing, but was very different as a mother herself. I mean, when you read the writings of her son, it's quite fascinating. And I think this really ties into when you talk about children don't really understand. They need their parents to help them. But what happens when their parents are so traumatized they can't be there for their children to help them to understand, to give them that sense of safety and protection, which ties into what I'm really interested in, which is John Bowlby's work all around attachment theory and the role between parent and child, which Alice Miller speaks about too. So not to dismiss her work, because it is still very important work. I learned a lot from reading, especially the drama of the gifted child.
Yeah, see, you're touching on something that is a very challenging aspect of this sort of deconstruction of social engineering. Is that, and like I studied social psychology. When I first was drawn into social psychology, I saw in it, ways to understand how reality was being manipulated through propaganda, through the media, through generating fear, and so on. And then to realize another layer, that these techniques and scientific approach to psychology has been weaponized and used against us. Like that's so I didn't know this about Alice Miller. Are you saying that Alice herself was an abusive parent, or that?
I'll put a link to it on the YouTube channel also. It was surprising to me. A friend told me about it because I was speaking about Alice Miller. I had no idea. And her son talks about what an abusive mother she was. And so again, it goes into so I'm going to make a little bit of a turn right here, because it kind of goes into some of the stuff too, where people can say, well, so-and-so is disinformation, or they don't know what they're talking about, or they're spreading an agenda. But there's still truth in what the person speaks. And so it's about not dismissing information, just like to paint it with a broad brush and say, hey, you can't ever listen to Alan Watts because all of his work is like hijacked and he's, pushing the new age agenda for the CIA. He did have some really valid things to say. So I think it's important to go back and to respect, how can we discern and not think that somebody else has to discern it for us and tell us ourselves? How can we read it or engage with the person such that we can take from it and understand the truth of what they're saying?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, and you mentioned one example of many, Alan Watts. I personally take a kind of stricter point of view now. I went through a thing with Alan Watts. His books were really important to me when I was first making the links between Western psychology and Eastern religion. And when I first decided to get interested in psychedelic drugs, his book, The Joyous Cosmology, was a real opener. And then I came to become very close with a really wonderful woman named Nina Graboy, who was very involved in that early 60s movement. And she knew Alan Watts. They were lovers, and she pointed out stuff about him that really, really turned me off. And I began, in my early involvement with Eastern religion, like, it's one thing to read a spiritual book. It's another thing to have performed these exercises and transformed your consciousness. And Buddhism, for example, is not just about reciting words on a page, but it's about having a certain grip on your own consciousness and not falling prey to a lot of these human tendencies that Alan Watts did. I mean, he was and I don't mean to judge him exactly, but he wasn't a real happy fellow. He was an alcoholic. He died of alcohol poisoning he was younger than me, in his 50s. And so I just have to think that his own consciousness affects those words. And I don't recommend reading Alan Watts anymore.
I really appreciate you bringing that up, because there is something to it. I'm trying to be somewhat magnanimous, because I've often been told that I can be very direct and about some of the things that I say. So I was trying to be a little bit more magnanimous about it and saying that, well, maybe there is more, but what happens when we have information such that, should we really be trusting? Because like one of the things about quality disinformation is it's got enough truth in it to lure us in, but ensures that we come to the wrong conclusions.
Okay, that's an important observation. Yeah. I jotted this down on Facebook the other day with that line. I think it's from a Bob Dylan song. Don't follow leaders, watch your parking meters. Or like the Buddha said that too in one of his last sayings was, be lamps unto yourself. Mm-hmm. This is an important part of what I think is the truly transformative aspect of the 60s movement, is the shifting of the locus of authority from outside there from institutions or leaders, but to really take responsibility for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And to form, groups, sanghas, communities of people that are looking like all those guys out there. They're all very suspect. The media, the schools, the institutions. And this is really, now this, we have to be careful here, because there are, we're going to talk about Timothy Leary, I guess, in this conversation. And this was his main thrust of his teaching, is question authority, think for yourselves. But think for yourselves in a systematic and disciplined way. I'm not talking about a just kind of reckless, sort of hedonistic, renunciation of all form.
In a way that confirms what you believe. So one of the things that you and I also spoke about is the whole notion of cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance ensures that I will take an information that that confirms what I believe. And we're living in a world now that really is so personalized that I can listen to what news I want. I can listen to what people I want that are not going to challenge my belief. And I never really realize or even validate that there might be something else out there for me to consider. So this whole thing about questioning authority is really important. And the thing that goes with this in authority is this other focused type of perspective where people look outside of themselves to consider, who am I in the world? And they'll think, hey, I think about who I am by how I think you think I am, Bob. So, Robert, so what do I think about you is how I think about myself. And so we've really seen this shift that's happened since the 1960s to more of a herd mentality about people like looking the same, buying the same things, like in groups and out groups, and thinking about themselves in that way based on the external, versus instead of who they really are inside.
Yep.
Who am I?
Yep. It's a very complicated thing. People thought of the 60s movement as a break from authoritarianism. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people don't realize that it was just a shift to another kind of authoritarianism. Yes. Like you look at the rock and roll scene, instead of, we think of authoritarianism and, you've got these hordes, the masses all praising Adolf Hitler, standing in neat rows, and there's Adolf projecting all this authority onto the Führer, and how, but then you can, you flash forward to the 1960s, and so people aren't wearing button-down uniforms, but they're all wearing tie-dye shirts, and having these eccentric sort of hairstyles, all sort of the same. And it's not Adolf Hitler that they're projecting power onto, it's Jerry Garcia or Peter Townsend or something. It's the same sort of format, like one big star, and there's still deadheads that walk around thinking Jerry was some sort of avatar. He was an artist, he was a brilliant guitarist, but this projection of some sort of religious,
Yeah, but he was also working with the CIA too. I mean, there's a bigger agenda.
Well, I think that's a little more complicated than that, because I've studied this a bit, and I think that, Jerry wasn't. Jerry was an artist who was exploited by those oligarchs. But Jerry, I believe, And I met him once just briefly, but I knew other members of the Grateful Dead. And I was
Oh.
talking about this yesterday with a friend of mine who's a rock star himself, that they're very, very different people. And it's, yes, the Grateful Dead was a CIA mind control operation. But Jerry, you know, in the mid 1970s, Jerry's came out and said, you know, like, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be part of a CIA operation. And he was tormented and conflicted about it, you know, so it's a little more complicated than that.
I think that's a really great point, because things are more complicated, and it's easy to be reductionistic and say it's either this or it's that, but it's more of a both and.
Yeah.
And people are, like Timothy Leary, who you brought up, which I know is going to raise the ire of some people who might be listening to this, is that the people are more complex. And they can change, and their views can change, but we tend to gravitate towards like certain anchors about what we think that they did. But what do we really know?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's complicated. You know, so Timothy Leary, I got to know very well over, you know, like 2 decades. His best friend, who turned him on to psychedelic drugs, was a very close and important teacher of mine, a mentor for a long time, Frank Barron. And we had many, many conversations about Tim and about the role of the CIA here. And, you know, we have to have a little empathy for these guys and what was really going on beginning in the late 1940s, and realize, you know, these are guys that are in their, you know, they're in their 20s and 30s when they're just starting this. And you and I know from people in their 20s and 30s are just like starting to form themselves. And so it's really a mistake to take a picture of who they were then and project it through the whole course of their life. These are men who are works in progress. Very complicated time of American history. And Tim changed a lot during the course of his life, and so did Frank Barron. But if you read their writings, you can see that they were aware of this mind control operation being inflicted on America, and they, I believe, really devoted their lives to undoing it. They're in a position...
Like with Timothy Leary, because I mean, some of the stuff that I read near the end sounded like he was kind of promoting the whole transhumanism thing.
Well, Tim promoted all kinds of stuff, you know, and I'm going to defend him, but I'm not going to idealize him. You know, he was, and I'm writing another piece about him. You know, I published a book about Tim, his Festschrift, a memorial volume where I just drew together many of his friends and closest colleagues to write their reflections on him. And I lived at his house for 2 or 3, 4 days a week the last year or so of his life, and became very close to him. He's a very flawed and complicated man, and he made many mistakes that he was very humorous about himself. You know, like one of his great lines was, look, 1/3 of what I've said is dead wrong. 1/3 of what I've said is complete bullshit. And then he said, but 1/3 are base hits. And that gives me a 333 batting average, and I'm going to be in the Hall of Fame. And he had that kind of humor. He knows he made a lot of mistakes. He knows he was used by the CIA to be a pawn in a mind control game. He wrote about that. He came right out and said it many, many times. 85% of my decisions were suggested to me by CIA people. He knew that the whole Berkeley Institute of Personality Research and Assessment was infiltrated with CIA. He made it very, he wrote in the 70s how American psychology was the first target of CIA mind control, and how pitiful it is that most psychologists and citizens have no idea, and they don't even really care about it. So he was, you know, he was a fun-loving guy, and he saw what was going on, but he didn't really want to martyr himself so completely and alienate. He loved to be in the media spotlight. He loved being in Hollywood. He was recruited by the CIA. He knew it. I don't know what sort of oaths he took, but he was conflicted and tormented about it all. It's not like he was, as Joe Atwill's phrase, a lifetime actor.
Right.
He broke from being an agent. He tried to rebel against their plan, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit, exactly how he did that, he and Frank Barron,
Uh-huh.
because this will bring in, one of...
Maybe you could explain to the audience, like, who was Frank Barron in relationship to Timothy Leary?
Well, Frank Barron was Timothy Leary's best friend from graduate school.
Uh-huh.
And they were, Frank was a veteran of World War II, actually saw combat
Mm-hmm.
in the thing that I'm writing. He spent the night hidden in the carcass of a cow during a bombing raid in Normandy. And when Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed, it just traumatized him profoundly, realizing that, that our species was in very grave danger, that we would have this savage power of the atomic bomb,
Mm-hmm.
and that we needed a corresponding leap in wisdom and human compassion if we were going to survive.
Mm-hmm.
And so he left the service. He got involved in psychology. He realized these were psychological problems. Why weren't more people seeing this?
Mm-hmm.
He saw a whole nation beginning to conform to the fear-based Cold War mentality, that we were becoming an authoritarian nation, just like Nazi Germany that we fought against.
Which was engineered to happen. You think about the authoritarian personality and Adorno and Horkheimer and Frankfurt School of Management, and thinking about all of the Nazis that came to the United States under Operation Paperclip. It's the Ponderization of the United States began to happen in the 1940s.
Yeah, so if you read Frank's memoir, book No Rootless Flower, where he goes to Berkeley, makes it very clear that the OSS, the intelligence apparatus of the US and the Allies in World War II, at the end of the war, basically became the CIA in these three sections. Part of it went to Harvard and became the Harvard Psychology Clinic under Henry Murray. Part of it went to Washington and became the actual CIA, and another part came to Berkeley and became the Institute of Personality Research and Assessment. And actually, that's where you mentioned Theodore Adorno. He was also at Berkeley. And so, this is part of my own transformation, because I read this stuff as a young student, thinking that there were these philosophers and social scientists in the 1950s who realized that America was becoming fascist.
Right.
And what to do about it. How do we avert this? And that's how I first read Adorno and the authoritarian personality. I'm still kind of in the middle of understanding this, because I can see in Adorno's research and writing the tools to undo this fascist authoritarian personality.
Interesting.
So did Frank Barron.
So if you think about, like, is there anything like you could talk about that you see that could be used to help to undo it? Because I think what's happening for me is a lot of times I see what's happening, but I'm not quite sure what we can do to start to untangle this web.
Okay, so this is where I'm kind of working, and the thoughts that I've had is like, so I said before, we have on the one hand, we have fascism, and on the other hand, we have democracy. Frank and many other social scientists at this period were trying to understand the worldview of the fascist personality versus the democratic, or what Frank would call creative personality. And it has to do with the locus of authority is one main thing. And the other thing has to do with their basic worldview, their basic sense of nature. Is the authoritarian is basically a fear-based character. And so they're kind of cowering from nature. They sort of cower from themselves, and they look outside for protection. And so they are easy to get to conform. Now, here's where I want to introduce the very important work of Solomon Asch. Okay, so let me just back up a little bit. Now, I like to think that anybody that's ever taken a psychology course in an American university knows of the work of Solomon Asch, one of the founding researchers in the field of social psychology. He was a Jew refugee from Poland during World War II. He also was horrified at how perfectly decent people were conforming to this savage regime of the Nazis and following orders and incarcerating and doing all these awful things. So Ash came over here, and he began a series of experiments on conformity, like how and why do people conform to authorities, even if they know that what the authorities are ordering them to do is wrong.
So it sounds like what Milgram was influenced then by Ash?
Yeah, I think that, well, they were certainly colleagues. They were at the same time. Ash was a little bit before Milgram. So Ash's famous experiment is the conformity experiment, which is, okay, so imagine you're a college student and someone comes up to you and says, here, I'm going to give you $5 to take part in in an experiment of your eyesight. And you say, okay, you come, you're led into a room. There's 19 other people in the room. Now you think they're all like you, just been taken off the street. But actually you're the only one being tested. Okay? So the experimenter draws 3 lines on a chalkboard. One line is 6 inches long, one line is 8 inches long, and another line is 6 inches long. And you're asked to say which 2 lines are the same length. It's obvious. It's an obvious thing. There's no ambiguity whatsoever. And the experimenter goes around and asks all 19 people. They all give the wrong answer. You're sitting there. You're the last one. You've just watched 19 people give the wrong answer to an obvious question. What do you do when it comes to be your turn? Well, when I ask this question to people, almost everybody says, oh, well, I would give the right answer.
Right.
But when Solomon Asch did this experiment beginning in 1947, upwards of 85% of those questioned, and this was first done at Swarthmore University back on the East Coast, one of our very best, most elite private schools. And he repeated this stuff. He went over to Yale, where I think he was at Yale. And then this experiment has been repeated. It's one of the most repeated experiments in all of social psychology, with all the way different varieties, but always like high 70% of the people would defy their own senses in order to conform to a socially constructed reality that was obviously wrong. Okay, so Frank Barron learned of these studies, and he thought, well, what about those 15% that didn't conform? What makes them different? And how do we get more people like that? And so he began to do psychological assessments on those. He went to work with Solomon Asch at Swarthmore and began to, study the psyche of those nonconformists. What gave them a more creative personality? What gave them the power, the confidence to trust more in their own inner sense of what's right and wrong? And began to realize certain things about them that he also drew from Adorno. Like, for instance, they believed that nature was a friendly place. They weren't afraid of nature. And they had a different locus of authority. And so he wanted to understand, how do we make more people like that?
You know what it sounds like to me? It ties into something called, in attachment theory, secure attachment, where when people have a more secure attachment, they have a more positive view of others and their intentions and of themselves. So they have high trust of self and high trust of others. And so when we find that people have more of an insecure attachment, whether they be on the avoidant side or preoccupied, there's an imbalance of trust.
Yeah.
And then the world feels less secure. And so this whole thing on a secure attachment also feels like there's a sense of safety in the world. So the more safe people feel, the more likely they're going to be able to be creative and explore these different perspectives.
Yeah. So, I don't know a lot about this, but this is where some people have wondered. There was also a pretty radical shift in our birthing and early nurturance of babies in American society, like breastfeeding somehow suddenly became unfashionable or unsanitary.
Well, absolutely. Because here's what I've discovered too. So attachment theory talks about the importance of the mother-child connection and the
Yeah,
mother providing that sense of stability, safety, predictability, caring, mind in mind, right, to the
yeah,
child. Feminism came in at the same time and says, well, you're basically blaming mothers. And so what began to happen is as feminism comes in, all of these things that are so foundational are no longer progressive, right? So we start to see the substitution of bottle feeding to breastfeeding. We
mm,
start to see women coming back into the workplace. We see a dramatic shift happening and almost a denial of biology and nature
yeah,
and a substitution for like this technological world.
yeah. Right. I just want to point out here again that feminism is another one of these things that I think is very similar to the psychedelic movement in that there is a there's there feminism, the way I see it, was percolating as an intellectual movement in the when did Rachel Carson write the book on nature? Early 50s. But there is a real problem with patriarchal thinking and a psychological lopsidedness,
Mm-hmm.
and there began to be an intellectual movement to try to enliven and propagate more feminine qualities of nurturance and inner power and interrelationship. And then feminism was infiltrated by the likes of Gloria Steinem.
Mm-hmm.
What did have the potential to kind of psychologically rebalance our culture
Mm-hmm.
became a weapon against it.
Mm-hmm.
Feminism became defined not as an enlivening of feminine qualities, inner
Mm-hmm.
qualities, but putting women on corporate boards,
Right. Well,
making women more like
masculinizing,
men.
right?
Hmm?
Exactly. Masculinizing women.
Masculinizing women.
You see that men were encouraged to be more feminine and not to be masculine, and women were encouraged, and still are encouraged, to be more masculine. So there's this imbalance in roles happening.
Yeah. Whereas there's a little truth in that. I mean, it like this concept of psychological androgyny, which was
Mm-hmm.
something I devoted some time to when I was an undergraduate. It's actually a healthy notion,
Mm-hmm.
for people to become more psychologically balanced and to own both aspects of our psyche, to integrate, our left and right hemisphere, whatever
Mm-hmm.
models you want to use. And but not then it gets overdone and it becomes into this sort of gender fluidity and
Well, that, and again,
confusion.
it's the replacement of biology and saying that it's a social construct, so that a male is really not a male biologically. It becomes a social construct, and so it's like this personalization of everything, to say, and this denial of biology and nature.
Yeah, which is going to alienate us from really the true source of our power, which is a resonance with nature. And I think that's, again, to back up what we saw with the manipulation of child rearing practices.
It's really important because this manipulation has resulted in a lot of insecurity, and people use
Yeah,
the word insecurity but don't really understand how it connects to attachment theory.
yeah,
And our sense of security is really important when we're feeling challenged and stressed. So when people are feeling challenged and stressed, it's the most important time for them to be able to self-regulate themselves and have awareness, but it's also the most difficult time to do that.
mm-hmm.
And I think this is what a lot of social engineering does, is it creates a world where people don't really mature. And so we see this regression that's happened in our culture over the last 40 to 50 years, maybe 60 years. And so people have almost less capacity to be able to do this, and they become more reductionistic. They tend to look for more simple solutions and do it outside of themselves. They want somebody else to tell them. So we're living in the realm of the experts and the authorities. And it
Yes.
goes back into, like, I think that's so fascinating what you were talking about. I'm looking at my notes is, you know, the polarity of fascism and then of democracy, creation, and nature, because it
Mm.
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's tricky. See, and here we can reintroduce the idea of psychedelic drugs and psychedelic experience, because here's where they have a very healing significance,
Mm-hmm.
because a mystical experience can create, and this is where Barron and Leary were originally trying to go with this religious experience, can heal the psyche, can give it that more secure bonding and sense of oneness with not the biological mother, but with the ground of being.
Mm.
And it can re-educate the person to understanding that nature is in fact wholesome and friendly. And if you look at the early memes that Tim and Frank were first putting out, it's like, go with the flow,
Mm-hmm.
trust in nature, trust in yourself, question authority, trust yourself, reconnect with a higher order, forget the institutions, forget Harvard, forget the government.
Yeah, but that all goes into what they're sold to with the American dream, where they can't forget those things because they're told that to go with all of that is what's going to bring them success in the world.
Yeah, well, it's a different kind of success. Who's getting to define what is success?
Right.
But, we look to jump forward here to the modern psychedelic renaissance, the propagation of these drugs in the media. It's no longer about
microdosing, and
it's no longer about questioning authority or think for yourself. I mean, the whole microdosing thing is that, which I had a peculiar role in starting in a way, is about making yourself a better worker. A guy like Steve Jobs is being held up as a model, like, oh, well, LSD will make you a billionaire like Steve Jobs. Mm-hmm. Steve Jobs was a fucking mess, man. Who wants to be like Steve Jobs? Here's a guy that dies of pancreatic cancer with $12 billion burning a hole in his gut. He was the chairman of a board of a company that uses slave labor. This is the absolute antithesis of what people like Leary and Barron held out as an ideal for a psychedelically transformed person. He was a greedy capitalist compared to, his friend. Jobs didn't invent anything. He was just a ruthless businessman.
Well,
the brilliance of the inventions was Wozniak, and he's a totally different character than Jobs. But
it's an interesting thing how we've learned to substitute materialism for meaning. And I think this is why we see there's such a profound lack of meaning, and people continuing to pursue things, and technology is becoming a substitute for this also, that people, it's like, who was it, Reisman talked about lonely together. So here we are together, and people don't even know how to connect or can connect.
Yep.
And we we see them, like, you go out, like my husband and I were at this great place, Enchantment in Sedona. We were sitting there, and it's like everybody was there, like on their phones, even couples together. They weren't connected with each other, and they weren't even aware of all the beauty that was around them. It was amazing to me.
Yep. It's terrifying. I know, you see it.
You know what? You're absolutely right. It is terrifying. It's like I was driving home from a client appointment last week, and this woman's like weaving into my lane. I'm like, hey, lady. And it's like, is she drunk? I'm like, no, she has her phone up and she's like texting.
Yep.
It's become an incredible addiction. And it's like, what really concerns me is I have a teenage daughter. And as a parent, I feel somewhat helpless around it because my daughter uses it a lot too. And it's almost like people are bonding to that.
Right.
And it's becoming more like maybe it's done on purpose to push people more towards a virtual reality.
Exactly. Yep.
Conformity.
One of the greatest challenges of being a parent is, keeping your kid. They try to rob their soul right from the get-go. They try to get you hooked on some sort of gadgets or devices or video game or corporately created thing to pull you from yourself. And so you need to really protect your children from that influence. But at the same time, equally important in a child's development are authentic relations, not only with nature, but with other people.
Absolutely.
You don't want your kid to be identified as an oddball, because then that has a counter effect. So how do you protect their soul and still nourish their very important sense of communitas. And
Well, Hans and I did a show on this. I don't know when it aired, maybe it was in February, where we began to talk about how our culture is becoming like an autistic culture, and that's almost becoming the ideal. And
yeah,
so, like, I have a young friend of mine. He tells me that people call each other a spurg, and I'm like, "What does that mean?" He's like, "Asperger's." That we call each other spurgs, and so it's almost becoming so normalized in our culture that this is going to become the standard, and it's kind of like and I know we're jumping all over the place, and I think it kind of does flow together, but it reminds me of artificial intelligence. That artificial intelligence wants us to be like that, and they almost feel like, I was reading an interesting article about this, that artificial intelligence makes it seem that emotions can be learned in a way that you can learn math. It takes the element of feeling out. It takes the element of the person out and consciousness out. And so it's like I don't know, it's like almost taking the life out of life and substituting the technology for life, and this whole thing of cybernetics, of like creating the perfect human machine. That there's this belief that a human is like a machine, and we can get humans to emulate being a machine.
yep, that is a description of the problem. And now what do we do about it? How do
What did Frank say? So, like, going back, like when you said he studied that 15%, is there anything that you can recall that stood out for you about that?
Well, that was the beginning of his interest in psychedelic drugs, and how
Okay.
and why he launched this psychedelic movement. He's not very well known because he kind of kept himself out of the limelight.
Mm-hmm.
But it was Frank. So Solomon Ash's data led Frank into the study of creativity.
Mm-hmm.
How do we inspire more creative thinkers?
Mm-hmm.
And then in this endeavor, he found psychedelic drugs,
Hmm.
and he thought that, and he took them himself.
Mm-hmm.
He was immediately cured of his long-standing battle fatigue, they called it back in those days,
Mm-hmm.
from the war.
Mm-hmm.
He thought that this was going to be the boost in human consciousness that would match the atom bomb.
Hmm.
That here were these mushrooms that could awaken this religious feeling of oneness with nature, empower the individual,
Mm-hmm.
enable them to recognize the practically limitless creative power of their own consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
how they created reality, and wean them from this authoritarian fear-based thing. And
Mm-hmm.
so he went back and told Tim about this, that this could be the holy grail of psychology, that we could use this as a way to wean people from institutional programs of the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
And they started the Harvard psilocybin project together.
I never heard of that.
And it was the first part of it was really giving these drugs to highly creative people,
Mm-hmm.
to just awaken their innate capacities,
Mm-hmm.
and to create new models of experience that were not fear-based, Cold War, militaristic. And then just a lot of chaos got generated.
So what year was this? When was this happening about, Robert?
Well, Frank had his first experience in 1958, and he found Tim was resistant until 1960. He had his first experience, it was in the fall of 59.
Uh-huh.
And then they started this project at Harvard in 1960.
Huh.
And it didn't go smoothly. It went rather chaotically.
Uh-huh.
They got into some material that was, again, these are guys that are in their late 30s.
Uh-huh.
And they're very bright, but they're really kind of kids, and they come from sexually confused Roman Catholic backgrounds. You start opening up the unconscious, you're going to find all sorts of demons and taboos, and you got to sort through a lot of that stuff. So the first couple years of this was kind of crazy. And Frank didn't like the way it was going, and so he dropped out. And Tim became more. He had very contradictory influences.
Uh-huh.
Like he became enamored with people like William Burroughs.
Oh, ooh.
You know, like William Burroughs. I never understood that. That guy is a creep, man.
Absolutely.
He's a pedophile. He
Killed his wife.
murdered his wife. You know, he has all the signs of being like a CIA
Psychopath.
assassin and psychopath. And you got, this is again how reality is socially constructed. You got another guy, Jack Kerouac, is somehow, you know, held up as some great hero. I mean, this is a guy that never, you know, like he died of alcohol poisoning when he was 45 years old. He was a tormented, fucked up guy, and somehow gets to model a new form of Buddhist freedom. There was nothing Buddhist about the guy. You know, he was a drug addict and a racist. And then you got, along with that, you've got Allen Ginsberg, who is another like really complicated character who doesn't, you know, you know, he's a pedophile, and he's, you know, sometimes he says things that are quite brilliant and seem anti-war, but other things he's saying, like, we all just need, like one important paper he wrote at the beginning of the 1960s is that, you know, we all need to just get high for the next 10 years, you know, an essay that was widely circulated. And I'm thinking, well, no, that's not really all we need to do is just get high. What we really need to do is like get our shit together and organize politically and listen to what Eisenhower was saying. And, you know, maybe use these drugs occasionally to punctuate awakenings, but this hedonistic degeneracy that he was advocated.
But exactly, that's what they were promoting. Because you think about it, there's no better way to control people than to give them liberation in areas like of sexuality and drugs. People become much more malleable.
Again, it's complicated because the sexual prohibitions, the repressive sexuality of a lot of modern religion is oppressive and destructive to the natural. We should trust our sexual instincts. You know, sexuality is a good thing.
But they're exploited. I mean, look at today, like with pornography. It's like,
I know. No, it's gone way over the other way. It's become profaned and trivialized and
exactly. Trivialized. And it's almost looked at cool. My daughter said, like her teacher said, all of them had to put their phones away in the classroom. She's in 11th grade. One of the kids was watching porn during class. I'm thinking to myself, could you imagine? It's like our grandparents being here today and witnessing what's happening. They've got to think that they're living in some sort of hell, because this can't be true. It's crazy.
Yeah. Well, the solution is not, you know, more of the other extreme, you know, and that's why we have now these kind of false dialectics and people going, you know, like the answer to widespread pornography is not, you know, widespread sexual repression. There's a middle ground in there, you know, a way to.
But that's how people are manipulated by.
That's how people are manipulated.
Right, they're one extreme to the other, and that's how people are manipulated.
Right.
And either or versus no both and, no ability to discern. And so what happens is the more stressed people become, they have a reduced ability to even discern what's happening with themselves or others.
Yep. So that's the key, is how do we amplify the qualities of discernment? That's really the main thing. And I like to think that was one of the most consistent messages in Leary's life is, you know, it wasn't just take drugs. It was think for yourself. It was question authority and think for yourself. And he was a very different character than a lot of these other celebrated icons of the 1960s. You know, you compare him to a guy like Ken Kesey, who I believe was a lifetime actor, as Joe Atwill describes. I mean, Kesey there wasn't any kind of systematic political message in what Kesey was doing. You watch the videotapes or the legacy of the whole Merry Prankster thing. It's really just about getting fucked up. It's
really about moving forward the agenda for social engineering too.
It's moving forward the agenda for social engineering that I believe that Leary was very focused on upsetting. Of all these characters in the 60s, Leary spent some serious time in jail. He spent 7 years in prison. He was the only one incarcerated. William Burroughs never spent any time in jail. Ginsberg didn't spend. Kesey didn't spend any time in jail.
Right.
They weren't questioning authority. They were actually working on behalf of authority to kind of degenerate and confuse the masses of their followers.
And confusion is really the name of the game now. It seems like people are so overwhelmed. There's so much information. It's like this whole thing on fake news. It's like it really furthers that. And narratives. There's so many narratives out there that people have a hard time discerning what's really true anymore.
Yeah.
Like, you see, like you and I, when we first started talking today, we were talking about what's happening now with McCain and how many people are talking about, he was a war hero. He was such a wonderful man. And it's like, well, really? Look at his life. Was he really?
Right. No. And if you put in both parties, yeah, there's a whole valorizing of John McCain as a war hero. And so I think that you're right. I mean, not just McCain, but I don't know if we want to get into the whole 9/11 thing. It's interesting. I talk about this, that look at to compare the decade of the 1960s, mm-hmm. which began with the assassination of Kennedy, let's say, 63, or Eisenhower's warning, and the decade that began this century, 2001. These incredibly traumatic events. The murder of a much-loved president, and then these towers, falling down in New York City, and how this obviously false story is asserted and unquestioned. And you got, masses of people. Again, it's like a Solomon Asch experiment.
True.
Like it doesn't take a rocket scientist to apply basic principles of criminology to the assassination of John Kennedy. And who benefited, who had the means, mm-hmm. who had the motive, and who benefited from this. It certainly wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald. Mm-hmm. Didn't have any means to do any of that stuff. I'll change the parade route or shoot these, precise shots through a tree. Like the whole story is like, it's not even well written. Mm-hmm. And 9/11, the same thing. And yet, when you ask people individually, they'll say, well, yeah, that didn't really make much sense to me.
Oh, I love to ask people, hey, so how did World Trade Center 7 fall?
Yeah,
well, Scooby-Doo look like,
Yeah.
It didn't get hit by anything. How did it fall like 6 hours later? And they start to give you an explanation. I'm like, wait a minute, like 5 minutes ago, you didn't even know what I just shared with you. And now you're telling me how it happened? That's cognitive dissonance kicking in, right? Because now they've got an aversive mental state because they're psychologically uncomfortable. So they've got to find a way to ameliorate that discomfort and come up with some sort of conclusion that's going to be acceptable to themselves so they can continue to believe what they believed.
Yeah. Yeah. So we live in a land of fools, but I get confidence in seeing more and more people that are awake to this. Mm-hmm. And how do we catalyze a movement, an intellectual movement or a political movement or a social movement or a creative, a cultural movement that unifies this realization that we've been tricked again? Mm-hmm. It's not the first time in the history of civilization that we've been tricked. Actually, mm-hmm. it's a repetitive pattern how we've been tricked. And
I've been tricked. I've been studying this for years, and it's like I've gone down certain rabbit holes. I'm like, I got duped again. And it's like, you have to get to a place where you recognize that. It's like, and now I recognize it more quickly, but I've had those experiences where I believed something absolutely, and then I came to find out that it wasn't true.
Yeah. How do we undo the cultural trance that we've been led into? And I think this is why your analysis and your work on cybernetics is, though it's quite dense and it requires really an advanced student of culture to really appreciate the sophistication of social engineering, that's going to be really important for you to advance this. I'm gonna do a little more work in the field of psychedelics to try to show that there's not one psychedelic movement. There are two really opposite psychedelic movements. There's a use of these substances or in religion. Religion is not just mind control. There are within the general field of religion, principles of morality and the golden rule and ethical systems and techniques to really refine and empower consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
as well as the massive superstition and disempowering. And so it's the same with psychedelics. There's not one psychedelic movement. There are two psychedelic movements. There really is an awakening going on in the culture where people can use these substances in intelligent ways to amplify the best of human nature. Now, unfortunately, that's a real minority. And that for the very most part, the way these drugs are being advanced in the culture through these institutions like MAPS or the Anglo elite psychedelic movement or these Johns Hopkins studies, they're being used to actually empower the institutions and further disempower the individual. And so myself and a growing number of colleagues and students are kind of taking note of this and kind of talking back to authority, to this fake renaissance, and trying to reclaim the truly transformative power of these psychedelic drugs for individuals.
Does that tie into that book that you were talking about by Pollan?
Yeah, well, the Michael Pollan book is clearly part of the operation to popularize psychedelic drugs, but in a way that serves elites.
How would you make that distinction about how it serves? Can you describe that a little bit?
Well, I think I just go back to this idea that I've said before, the locus of authority.
Mm-hmm.
And the way, see, there's a narrative that's being put forth that describes the first emergence of these drugs.
Mm-hmm.
See, I believe that they were first introduced into American society in the 1950s to create a Brave New World scenario. Aldous Huxley was one of the chief agents who propagated these drugs in society, and to create a brave, not to ward off, but to create a Brave New World society. Now, our listeners probably know Brave New World, pictures an advanced totalitarian society, a pyramid, all the wealth is controlled at the top, militaristic, there's vast numbers of people below it, but they don't do anything to rescue themselves. They love their servitude. Right. Whenever they get a bit restive about their fate, they're given this drug, soma, that makes them feel like everything is okay, even when everything is not okay. And then Huxley wrote Brave New World Revisited in 1958, saying, yeah, this has happened a lot faster. And now today's soma are these psychedelic drugs, which people can take and they can find relief from their political and economic oppression. And so they began to, Gordon Wasson wasn't just a friendly banker. He was a guy who was working hand in glove with the CIA to create this society. And Leary was recruited, and Leary realized what was going on, and he put a new spin on it. He said he used these drugs, as I said, in this way that he and Barron devised. So now the narrative is, psychedelic drugs had this terrific potential in modern society until Timothy Leary entered the story and fucked it all up. And this is, you read all these articles, practically every single article that praises psychedelic drugs in the last 20 years has this narrative. They were great. Psychiatrists, the institutions were realizing how good they could be to fight alcoholism or fight this or fight that. Depression, until Leary comes along. And then you read the Pollan book, and it's like the most, it's this narrative. The only critical thing he says about psychedelic drugs in the whole book is about how Timothy Leary ruined it for everybody. And so, and then he takes a jab at people that think 9/11 was an inside job, that that those are the crazy people. Really? And yeah, no, it's astonishing. And it's a total rewriting of the actual history of psychedelic drugs to serve this new renaissance. And I believe Pollan was, he's a staff writer for the New York Times and a professor at Harvard and Berkeley. He's a propagandist.
Exactly.
He's a very articulate, friendly guy, but he's pulling the wool over people's eyes and writing a false story.
I think required reading should be Jacques Ellul's book Propaganda, that people should understand how propaganda works. And it can be very difficult to discern it, especially now, like we have with the NDAA that allows under the Smith-Mundt Act, the government to promote propaganda as its truth. So this has been really interesting, and I'd love to have you back on again. So like we're done, I probably went a little bit over our time today, but I would love to continue this conversation because there's so many interesting things that you've brought up, and it's definitely given me more to think about.
Yeah, we didn't really get into the cybernetic stuff, but maybe we've laid out the problem a little bit, and be interesting to see what your listeners or your viewers have to say, and we'll keep this going.
Great, thank you so much, Bob.
My pleasure.
Okay,
Enjoy the
bye.
rest of your day, Kathy. Bye-bye.